In last week's episode, we talked about Marshall McLuhan's theory for hot versus cold media. Let's see what you had to say. Bobart the creator on the subreddit raises a really interesting question about what exactly it is counts as a medium. But before we get into that conversation, one thing that I want to touch on is this idea that my dismissal, as Bobart the creator calls it, of the internet as a wasteland, a frozen wasteland. And I want to be clear that Marshall McLuhan predicted a lot of things about technology as it exists today and things like the internet, but he did not have much interaction with anything like the internet as we know it, maybe like the very, very early parts of it that were very different from what we know it as. And so the first thing I want to say is that any sort of judgment about the internet that was leveraged in last week's episode is not from Marshall McLuhan's perspective. It's my sort of imagined idea of what he might think. And I also want to make sure that we're not saying that, I think I described it as a frozen tundra or something like that, that's not necessarily a dismissal. And I think that this is another one of the things that's kind of confusing about the hot versus cold theory or dichotomy, is that it can feel like a judgment call in a lot of ways, depending upon the words that you use to describe these differing states and the different characteristics of media. And so to say that the internet is frozen in some way is not, I want to make sure, a way to dismiss it or to say that it is bad or an environment that you do not want to inhabit. I just mean it as a way to describe what I think McLuhan would see as a kind of fundamental and extreme kind of participation, or the nature of its sort of participation. Okay, now on to the second part of Bobart the creator's comment, which questions how we consider the internet as a medium. And their idea is essentially that we might consider each individual website as a particular medium, and that is how we can talk about the hotness or the coldness of the internet on a website by website basis, as opposed to talking about the internet as a whole as one particular medium. And I think this is a really interesting theory. I don't know that I am totally on board. When I think about sort of porting this idea to other spaces that might look similar, like if we were to port it over to television, do we feel comfortable saying that television itself is not a medium, but that each individual channel is? And I think the answer is no, but there's also a really good counter argument there that, television stations between one another, channels, are not remarkably different. They don't show remarkably different content in the same way that the internet and websites might. But there is, I think there's, for some reason there, I feel this kind of fundamental hesitance in calling each individual website, as opposed to the internet as a whole, a medium. And I'm gonna think about it some more, but I would love to know what all of you think. Hellfire120, Elliott Collins, and a bunch of other people brought up video games as a really important and necessary part of this conversation because of their very literal participation. And I think that this is one sort of sticking point that came up over and over again in the comments. And when Marshall McLuhan was writing about participation, he didn't really mean participation in the way that we mean participation when we talk about video games being participatory. He meant it as more the kind of almost like sense-based work that we have to do in order to turn a specific medium into the thing it hopes to be. And so what he was saying was that television requires a lot of participation because the image quality is low, and so we have to assemble this low quality image into something in our minds that is close to reality so we can understand what it is and what it means. And he was saying that you have to do less of that for things like movies and radio, because those things are more, they're closer to what they actually are. He was saying that the quality of images in movies is closer to reality than the quality of images on television, and so they require less participation for us to kind of assemble, which is a weird idea. He's not talking about physical, literal interaction. That being said, I do think of video games as a cold medium because of the extreme amount of meaning that we have to wring out of them in basically just understanding how their worlds are put together, and that most video games require an intense level of spatial or situational awareness, and that requires us to do endless amounts of interpretation on the visual field to place our characters, to interact meaningfully within the world. And so that, I think, is the kind of participation that would make a video game cold, as opposed to literally, having to physically interact with something that changes the state of the picture that you see. Made.a.universe brings up a really great point about the sort of rise in prominence that Marshall McLuhan experienced, and then the kind of decline in popularity and reputation that he had amongst academic circles, that he was dismissed as a kind of a showman, but that, that didn't stop him from doing a lot of really amazing work and popularizing the idea of cultural and media studies. He did a lot of really amazing and important things, and I just wanna make it clear that in both last week's video and future But Wait videos, the counter-arguing that we're gonna do against certain theories and theorists isn't a way to sort of disprove or debunk any of those people or their thoughts. It's just a way to sort of show how different theories can be used in different ways, and that there's not sort of one way to think about things that solves all problems or that is appropriate in all situations. So I just want to say that. Gutenberg Galaxy, loved it. Love that book. Understanding Media, love it. I don't love everything about it, but it's an important work, has lots of great ideas in it, and did a lot for this area of study. So yeah, Marshall McLuhan, good guy. Insofar as anybody is a good guy. James A. Lancaster and Malcolm Ross both bring up really great points about how we consider mediums as monoliths and whether or not it's okay or permissible to do that kind of thing. And in last week's episode, one of the sort of counter arguments to McLuhan's hot and cold theory is that we bring our sort of expectations and our experiences to each individual work that we experience, and so that is maybe more so what determines hotness or coldness, and that it is we who are hot or cold and not the things themselves. But James and Malcolm both say that there is really some fundamental characteristic that we can attribute to each individual medium, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, and that is what sort of allows us to have those expectations. It's what allows us to sort of know what we're getting into when we listen to radio, when we watch television, when we watch movies, when we read a book, and that insofar as there might be any one particular media or one particular instance, one particular TV show, one particular movie that is more hot than its medium is cool, that is colder than its medium is normally hot. The reason it's able to do that is because we understand television normally is a specific way, movies normally are a specific way, and that these things can sort of move away from this center point that describes their medium, and the reason they can do that is because of its kind of like fundamental characteristics. And I think this is a really interesting and a really great idea, a level of nuance that we didn't really get into in the episode itself. So yeah, a great counter argument. For anybody who is interested, Phelanii basically nails it on the hot and coldness of lectures versus seminars, paper versus stone tablets, and phonetic alphabets versus ideographic alphabets. Nice work. To Jeff, Kayla, Nathan, and everyone else who is excited about further and future But Wait videos, thank you so much. It's always nice to have some encouragement when we try something new. We have another one in the works that's gonna come out actually next week. We decided to sort of group them close together to see how we like doing them, how you guys like them, so thanks. Hopefully we'll make more. If you have suggestions for things that you are interested in hearing about, let me know in the comments. There are ones that I think I actually kind of want to avoid because they've just worked their way into Idea Channel videos, and I'm kind of actually bored of talking about them, like the simulacra or the death of the author. Like, I don't really want to but wait those. I'm kind of interested in stuff that's maybe a little bit more under the radar. Eyebrows. Lorenzo, I propose from this point forward, whenever anybody unexpectedly or unnecessarily brings up Lacan, we call it zhizhing. All bones. Chuck Tingle. So hot right now. And probably hot forever always, especially if you're into unicorns.